Because so many dozens of nobles had killed each other during the War of the Roses, there weren't enough nobility left to rule over the peasants, so the King of England became the primary authority in the land, and he quickly abolished the English people's right to a jury trial. Henry VII kept what was left of the nobles under control with harsh laws and a star chamber with which to enforce them, and he also ended the law of entail that allowed people to own land strictly by a particular line of heirs, so business opportunities opened up to more than just the landed gentry. Henry VII taxed and fined the English until he had a very large treasury, and those taxes were collected by putting anyone in jail who complained, but Henry VII gave the English people great roads for the money. Henry VII made a matrimonial contract with the Spanish Ferdinand and Isabella to marry his first-born son Arthur to their daughter Catherine, and 4 years later they were married in 1501, but Arthur died suddenly less than 5 months later at the age of 15, and England and Spain agreed that Arthur's widow Catherine should now marry Arthur's younger brother Henry, the second son, who was at the time only 11 years old. And Catherine had been almost 1 year older than Arthur, and was 5.5 years older than Henry VIII. Henry VII's wife died the following year at the age of 37 after giving birth to her 7th child, a girl named Catherine with a K who lived for 8 days, and her mother died the day after, and Henry VII would die 6 years later in 1509 at the age of 52. The firstborn Arthur had been named after the legendary King Arthur of Camelot, and Catherine was a good Spanish Catholic, and her only child to survive more than a few months after marrying Arthur's brother Henry VIII would be a daughter named Mary, who would become the Queen of England as Mary I, when Henry VIII's only male child by his third wife would die at the age of 15, just like Arthur. Henry VIII's daughter Mary I would be raised as a devout Catholic in honor of her mother with her Spanish heritage, and Mary I would become the wife of the King of Spain. And the most fervent desire of Spain was to make England Catholic again. But there would be no going back, because Henry VIII had stolen all the Pope's money and property in England to start his Episcopal Church, and while Henry VIII had been squandering away all the Pope's money, along with the abundant treasury his father had saved up for England, the Moslem Turks made it all the way to Vienna in 1529. The French had added more territory to France and become a strong country while the English were busy with the War of the Roses. And France had been fighting the Holy Roman Empire in Italy for 4 years when Louis XII became the King of France in 1498 at the age of 36. And Louis XII's cousin had died after hitting his head on a doorpost at the age of 27. And when Louis XII became the King of France, he'd already proven himself as a commander on the battlefield in Italy. This prompted Henry VII to move swiftly to marry by proxy his 12-year-old son Arthur to the Holy Roman Empire's Spanish Catherine the following year in May of 1499, cementing an assurance that England would be able to use the Holy Roman Empire as a shield against any unwanted advances from France. As soon as Arthur and Catherine were married in September of 1501, James IV of Scotland was promised in January of 1502 in marriage to Henry VIII's sister Margaret, and that alliance was the first in almost 200 years and was supposed to bring the Scots closer towards England, away from their friendship with France. Their son would become James V, who would be the father of Mary Queen of Scots, and Mary Queen of Scots would also be a friend of France. And 2 months after Henry VIII's sister married the King of Scotland, Arthur was dead at age 15. So the marriage between Arthur's widow Catherine and Henry VIII was deemed crucial and urgent to bolster the English realm against the power of France. Margaret's first child would be born 2 months after her 17th birthday, and he died when he was a year old. And her second child died shortly after birth, and her third baby would not live for 1 year. But her fourth child survived, followed by 2 more who perished, and the only surviving child was James V, born in April of 1512, and upon him Scotland placed all their hopes. Margaret's brother Henry VIII had grown up rather unsupervised, because he'd not been expected to become king since every eye had been on his older brother Arthur. And on Christmas Day, when Henry VIII was 7 years old, the palace at Richmond burned down. And when he was king for 3 years, Westminster burned down, and the only rooms that weren't totally destroyed had been his bedroom and the dining room. When Henry VIII became king, he got rid of all the old smoke-damaged tapestry telling stories of the Old Testament, and he modernized and redecorated the palace, and Henry VIII raided the coffers and turned the palace into a party. Henry VIII was a breath of fresh air in London, which was still a medieval walled town when he was crowned, and young Henry VIII was handsome and slim and athletic, and people thought he looked like a Greek god. And Henry VIII could dance all night and drink everyone under the table, and he hosted jousting parties that lasted for days, and the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Spain was pushed through less than 2 months after the death of Henry VII, 1 week before Henry VIII turned 18 years old, while Spanish Catherine was 23, and then Henry VIII went off to help his wife's father fight Muslims in Spain. Henry VIII already had 8 palaces, but the new and improved Westminster was so nice that he built 8 more, and Catherine had come to England with 160 servants, who were the relatives of the rich and powerful in Spain, and her friends and servants spoke Spanish and stayed to themselves, and one of Catherine's few English servants who was not of royal blood was Anne Boleyn's mother. In June of 1519, Henry VIII became a father by producing a son with Elizabeth Blount, who would later marry Lord Clinton, and the son was named Henry Fitzroy and was given the title of the Duke of Richmond. And Henry Fitzroy would become sick and die in 1536 at the age of 17. At the time of his death, Parliament had been preparing an act of succession that would allow Henry VIII to appoint his successor without any limitations on the choice. In the first 10 years of marriage to Henry VIII, Spanish Catherine had borne 1 surviving girl child and had suffered 4 miscarriages and gave birth to 2 babies that lived less than 2 months. And in February of 1518, Catherine announced her final pregnancy, and the baby girl was born on the 10th of November, but only lived a few hours. And Henry Fitzroy would be born 7 months later, in June of 1519. Henry VIII also became romantically involved with Anne Boleyn's sister during his marriage to Catherine, but some versions say he waited for 10 years before casting about for a different wife, and it was rumored that he had fathered other male children well before Henry Fitzroy died. So when Henry VIII fell in love with Anne Boleyn, he harbored no doubts that she would give him a male heir to carry on the royal bloodline. Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary Boleyn were sent to France right after Louis XII's second wife, Anne of Brittany, died in January of 1514 at the age of 36. And Anne of Brittany died after bearing 9 children, with only 2 girls surviving, and Claude was her eldest daughter. Before her marriage to Louis XII, Anne of Brittany had borne 7 children from her marriage to the previous Charles VIII of France, who died in 1498, and of those 7 children, the only one that had survived more than a few days, with the exception of 1 boy who lived for a month, was a boy who died of measles at the age of 3. When Charles VIII died, Anne of Brittany was only 21 years old, and they'd been married when she was 2 months shy of her 15th birthday, and Charles VIII was 21. And her first child was born 4 months before she turned 16 years old. When Anne of Brittany died, Anne Boleyn's older sister Mary Boleyn was sent to France in 1514 to be a maid of honor for Henry VIII's 18-year-old sister Mary Tudor, who'd gone to France to become the 3rd wife of the 52-year-old Louis XII. And Mary Boleyn stayed in France after Louis XII died, less than 90 days after marrying Henry VIII's sister. And Mary Boleyn and her younger sister Anne stayed in France because their father had just become the new English ambassador to France. Mary Boleyn was 15 years old, and she was the same age as Louis XII's daughter Claude from his marriage to Anne of Brittany. And the next king of France would be Francis I, who would be thought to be the father of Henry VIII's second surviving daughter, Elizabeth I, born to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was 15 years younger than Henry VIII, and as a maid of honor at the French court, she'd probably been a translator for Claude at the meeting of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where the Spanish Catherine had been in attendance. And the Holy Roman Empire was doing well because Louis XII had lost more Italian land to Spain. Catherine wanted Henry to ally with the Holy Roman Emperor rather than with France, and Henry VIII wanted to make deals, not war, so he'd been seeking out other company during the 17-day summit meeting called the Cloth of Gold. The Treaty of London had just been signed in 1516, hoping to end all war between Europeans, with the intention of their uniting against the Moslem incursions, and it might have worked, except that Henry was bent on divorcing his Spanish wife Catherine, who was failing to give him a male heir, and rather than discussing Moslems with the new king of France, Henry VIII only wanted to talk about women. Louis XII had only 2 living children, both of them daughters who couldn't become the King of France, and he made the eldest Claude at age 15 marry Louis XII's 20-year-old cousin Francis I in May of 1514, 4 months after her mother Anne of Brittany had died. 5 months later, Louis XII married Mary Tudor, and when Louis XII died 90 days later, Francis I became the new King of France in January of 1515. The Cloth of Gold meeting in 1520 was between Francis I and Henry VIII, and in those 17 days they were supposed to show off how wealthy and powerful England and France were, so that the Treaty of London would carry more weight to the rest of the world. Anne Boleyn spoke French and would have been put to good use during the conference, and Anne Boleyn returned to England in 1521 at the age of 15, leaving behind Claude, who would die 3 years later at the age of 24 in July of 1524 after bearing 7 children, 1 every year, and only 2 of those children would live past the age of 30. Anne Boleyn's older sister Mary had come back from France in 1520, a year sooner than Anne Boleyn, to marry one of the knights who had jousted for Henry VIII at the Cloth of Gold Convention, and the summer before, Henry VIII had found out that he was capable of fathering a male child, Henry Fitzroy. Anne Boleyn would accompany Henry VIII to France for another state visit with Francis I in 1532, and History Anonymous wrote that Anne and Henry were secretly married in November of 1532 and then formally married in January of 1533, and Henry VIII crowned Anne Boleyn on the 1st of June in 1533, and her daughter Elizabeth was born on the 7th of September in 1533. Francis I was 12 years older than Anne Boleyn, and he had invited Anne Boleyn again to the French court for Christmas in 1532, when Anne Boleyn was trying to get Henry VIII to declare her worthy of becoming his queen. And 3 years after marrying Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn would be sentenced to death in May of 1536, and a French executioner was brought over because the English axemen couldn't be trusted not to make her suffer. Henry VIII was betrothed to his next wife, Jane Seymour, the day after Anne Boleyn's execution, or not, and they were married 10 days later, and the first thing Jane Seymour did was to get rid of anything French left over from Anne Boleyn. Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, in October of 1537, and she died 12 days later of complications from the delivery, and Henry VIII would have no more children after Edward VI. Henry VIII signed a contract with Scotland and their French friends that Henry's baby boy, Edward VI, would marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and as soon as the ink was dry, Henry VIII went over to France and captured Boulogne in 1544, since the Scots had been pacified back home with the promise that their Mary Queen of Scots would become the future Queen of England. Henry VIII told the French to pay him 2 million crowns within 8 years, and he said that the English would stay in Boulogne until they got their money. But 2 years later, King Henry VIII was dead at the age of 55, and it had not been an easy death. The English Parliament had voted to absolve Henry VIII of all his debts right after the Boulogne excursion. And when Henry VIII died in 1546, he'd been king for almost 40 years. And the good that came of the English king becoming head of his own Episcopalian church was that an English Bible was ordered to be placed in every English place of worship. So now those who could read were able to do so for themselves instead of hearing what the clergy had decided was written therein. At first, Henry VIII had told the Pope that he would join with Spain and the rest of the Holy Roman Empire to fight France and give French land to the Pope. And Henry VIII had sent an English army into southern France in 1511, but the Spaniards had seen no reason to march towards the French first before the English moved, so the battle plan had failed, and the English sailed back home. Henry VIII came back to France in person a year later and conquered 2 French towns that are no longer on the map. And while he was overseas, the Scots invited the French to come over and invade England, but they were badly beaten at Flodden Field. Scotland had marched because Henry VIII was claiming to be their overlord. And the tide had turned for Henry VIII when the Pope refused to let him marry the pregnant Anne Boleyn, and so Henry VIII had stood up to the Pope and started his own church in 1534, and 19 years later, in 1553, Henry VIII's only son would die at the age of 15 before being able to marry the 10-year-old Mary Queen of Scots. The death of Edward VI left his half-sister Spanish Mary as the new Queen of England, and she was a raging Catholic bent on returning England to the benevolence of the Pope. The plan to keep England Protestant had failed because the young King Edward VI died before signing papers that would exclude his half-sister Mary in favor of his younger Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. So the Protestants in England came up with an alternate plan. If Catholic Mary Queen of Scots was safely sent to France, the English crown could go to Lady Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary Tudor, the one who had married the King of France and had come back to England to marry the Duke of Suffolk after Louis XII died 3 months into her marriage. Thus, Mary Queen of Scots was shipped back to France as soon as Henry VIII died, and the Protestant Lady Jane Grey became the Queen of England for 10 days until Catholic Spanish Mary I supplanted her. Mary Queen of Scots had been crowned the Queen of Scotland at Stirling Castle in 1543 when she was 9 months old. And at the age of 5, she'd been taken to France to be raised at the French court until her betrothal to the French prince could turn into a marriage. In 1558, Mary Queen of Scots signed a secret agreement with France that Scotland, along with her claim to the English throne, would revert to the French if she died without producing children with the French prince, and 20 days later the 2 teenagers were married in the Cathedral of the Notre Dame in Paris. Henry VIII had excluded the Stuarts from succession, but Catholics considered his daughter Elizabeth I to be illegitimate. And the downside of Henry VIII having founded his Protestant Church of England and making the Bible available in English to all members of his Episcopal Church was that the English, having read the Holy Bible for themselves, were now that much less willing to return to Catholicism, yet Henry VIII's Spanish daughter Mary I would do her damnedest to thrust it back upon them.